Before our story begins, allow the day to grow quiet around you. Let your breathing become slow and easy, and permit the weight of the blankets to hold you comfortably where you are. There is nowhere else you need to go tonight, and nothing more that must be finished. Beyond the window, the lanes of a small Cotswold village are growing dark. A few lamps shine behind curtained windows. Smoke rises gently from the chimneys, and at Mallow House, a fire has been lit in the kitchen range. Upon an old oak table lies a brown recipe book, its pages softened by many hands. Within it is a recipe without exact quantities, waiting for one woman to understand that not everything of value can be measured. And so, as the house settles around us, our story begins. By the time Adelaide Mercer's carriage reached the lower end of Mill Lane, lamps had already been lit behind the windows of Cresswell, though the church clock had not yet struck 5. The hedges had lost nearly all their leaves. Rain lay dark upon the stone walls, and the last apples in the cottage gardens had been gathered beneath pieces of sacking. Winter had not fully arrived, but the village had begun preparing a place for it. The driver pointed towards a house near the end of the lane. It stood a little apart from its neighbours, 3 stories of pale Cotswold stone behind a low wall, softened by moss. A brass plate beside the gate bore the words, Mallow House. Adelaide had imagined a modest establishment, orderly but tired. The house was larger than expected, though not grand. Its bow window held the amber reflection of a lamp, and smoke from the kitchen chimney folded into the rain. Beyond it, Mill Lane descended between cottages whose curtains were being drawn against the evening. A baker carried an empty tray beneath one arm, and somewhere behind a garden wall, a pump gave 3 slow iron strokes. The village appeared to be completing its outdoor work before the cold settled properly. The driver placed her trunk beneath the porch. Adelaide paid him and waited until the carriage had turned towards the village square before lifting the brass knocker. The door opened before it fell. A young woman in a brown working dress stood inside, wiping her hands upon an apron. She was small and fair, with sleeves rolled neatly to the elbow and a loose strand of hair resting against one cheek.
Miss Mercer? Yes, I'm Nell Price. Mrs. Harrow said I was to listen for the carriage.
Nell brought in the smaller case. The hall smelled of coal smoke, beeswax, and onions. 3 umbrellas stood in a blue jar. A row of boots occupied the mat beneath the staircase, none arranged quite parallel to the wall. On the hall table lay an envelope addressed to Adelaide in Judith's broad handwriting. Inside was a ring of keys, each tied with a paper label. Linen press, cellar, pantry, coal store, and front door. Beneath them was a short list. Milk came before 7. Bread came every second morning. The coal merchant was not to be paid until the weight had been checked. Miss Fenwick sometimes returned after supper. The kitchen range drew poorly in an east wind. At the bottom, Judith had written, "Remember the lower damper before bed. Everything else will tell you what it needs." Adelaide read the last sentence twice. It was typical of her aunt to make a clear statement and then weaken it with something that was not an instruction at all. Nell showed her to the parlour, where Mrs. Winifred Vale sat near the fire with grey wool gathered in her lap. She was a narrow woman with silver hair arranged carefully beneath a lace cap. A pair of spectacles rested upon an open music journal beside her chair. "You have had a wet journey," Mrs. Vale observed. Adelaide removed her gloves. "Only the last few miles." Mrs. Vale did not ask about Cheltenham or why Adelaide had come. Her restraint felt deliberate and kind. Miss Lucy Fenwick had not yet returned from the village school. Nell said she usually appeared soon after the lamps were lit, unless exercise books kept her later. Adelaide noticed the uncertainty in the arrangement. At the household she had managed in Cheltenham, supper had been served at 6:30, and everyone was expected to be present or send word. She went upstairs before removing her travelling dress. Mallow House had 6 guest rooms, though only 3 were occupied. Lucy's overlooked Mill Lane and contained a writing table crowded with copybooks. Adelaide's had been prepared with clean linen, a stone hot water bottle beneath the quilt, and dried lavender on the washstand. The linen cupboard held good sheets, arranged without labels. 2 pillowcases had been placed among the table linen, and 1 blanket required mending. Adelaide set it apart. Downstairs, she found eggs, flour, bread, onions, and half a ham. The cellar contained root vegetables and trays of apples. Some fruit had begun to soften where it touched its neighbor. "Mrs. Harrow says the softer ones are for cooking," Nell said from the stairs. "They should be separated before they spoil the sound fruit." Nell nodded, neither agreeing nor objecting. The kitchen was larger than expected. A black range filled one wall. Copper pans hung above a stone sink, and herbs dried from a beam. At the center stood an oak table marked by knife cuts, pale rings, and 1 dark scorch. Adelaide ran her fingertips over the surface. The table had been scrubbed clean, but never polished smooth. It held the history of work too plainly for her liking. At one end lay Judith's household ledger and a heap of receipts beneath a blue saucer. Purchases had been entered faithfully, but meals appeared only as brief notes. Soup, if Lucy is late, soft bread for Mrs. Vale. Use the apples near the wall first. There were no weekly menus, no quantities, no proper division between household expenses and provisions for guests. Adelaide closed the book. That evening, she ate a simple supper with Mrs. Vale after Lucy returned, damp at the shoulders and apologizing for the mud upon her boots. Nell brought in a stew that had waited near the range and bread warmed in a covered dish. The meal was plain, but the stew suited the rain, and Lucy's face regained some color as she ate. Adelaide noticed these things, but she also noticed that supper began 14 minutes later than Nell had predicted, that 1 spoon did not match the others, and that no one seemed certain whether Nell had eaten. After the house became quiet, Adelaide returned to the kitchen. She checked the lower damper, counted the eggs, and moved the soft apples into a separate tray. Then she drew a clean sheet of paper from her writing case. She made columns for rising, breakfast, deliveries, room work, dinner preparation, tea, and supper. She allotted time for polishing silver, turning mattresses, checking stores, and mending linen. At the bottom, she added a weekly menu, leaving no space blank. The range settled behind her with a low iron sound. Rain moved softly against the dark windows. Somewhere above, a floorboard answered the weight of a person crossing a room. Adelaide sanded the page and held it towards the lamp. Everything at Mallow House now had an hour, a place, and a line of its own. For the first time since the carriage had turned into Mill Lane, she felt certain she knew what the house required. The household awoke to a morning the color of unpolished pewter. Rain had stopped during the night, but water still slipped from the eaves at measured intervals and gathered in the stone basin beneath the kitchen pump. Adelaide was downstairs before Nell entered by the back passage. The range had kept a small red heart beneath its ashes. She opened the lower damper, added kindling, and watched until the flame took hold exactly as Judith's note had promised it would. Her new schedule lay beside the household ledger. Breakfast passed with only minor departures from it. Mrs. Vale preferred toast to the egg Adelaide had allowed for her. Lucy hurried away when she learned the schoolroom stove was drawing poorly. The bread arrived 6 minutes late. None of these matters was serious. Adelaide entered each one in a small notebook so that tomorrow might be arranged more accurately. For supper, she chose a menu from the cookery book she had brought from Cheltenham: roast mutton, potatoes, carrots with parsley, and a steamed currant pudding. The dishes were familiar, respectable, and capable of being prepared to a dependable standard. She wrote the necessary quantities on a sheet of paper and placed it above the work table. Nell read the list while tying on a clean apron. Mrs. Harrow usually stews the mutton when the weather is damp. This joint is suitable for roasting. Yes, miss. Nell's agreement was so complete that Adelaide could find no objection in it, although she suspected one remained. Adelaide weighed the flour and suet, leveled each spoonful, and removed the damaged currants. She showed Nell how the cloth should be floured and tied, so that the pudding retained a proper rounded shape. The mutton was trimmed, weighed, and placed in the oven at the specified time. Potatoes were selected in equal sizes. 2 unsuitable carrots were set aside for soup. By late afternoon, the kitchen had taken on the warm, concentrated smell of roasting meat, damp cloth and coal. The windows clouded from the lower panes upwards. Outside, Mill Lane darkened beneath a sky that had never properly brightened, and lamps appeared one by one behind the neighbouring curtains. Adelaide laid the dining room table herself. The white cloth had a ridge through its centre. Adelaide pressed it flat, chose 3 matching spoons, polished 1 knife, and placed the chairs at equal distances. Nell appeared in the doorway carrying a basket of kindling. "Should I put a place for myself in the kitchen?" Adelaide looked at the clock. "You may eat when the dishes have been cleared. There should be more than enough." Nell carried the kindling away. Mrs. Vale came down before the first dish was ready. She wore a soft grey shawl and stood for a moment beside the fire, warming her fingers. Adelaide noticed the older woman glance towards the kitchen when the carving knife touched the platter. "Miss Fenwick is not yet back," Mrs. Vale said. "Supper is arranged for 6:30. The girls sometimes keep her when there is a composition to finish." Adelaide had heard this already. She had also left a note beside Lucy's plate, indicating that the meal could not be held without affecting its quality. Yet when the church clock struck the half-hour, Lucy's chair remained empty. Adelaide served the mutton. The joint had browned evenly. Adelaide cut 3 equal portions and placed 1 beneath a covered dish for Lucy. Potatoes and carrots were arranged beside the meat. Mrs. Vale thanked her. She cut a small piece, chewed it slowly, and took a drink of water before attempting another. The mutton was not burnt. Adelaide had followed the cooking time precisely. Nevertheless, the meat had firmed more than she expected while resting near the range. Mrs. Vale moved to the potatoes and carrots. Whenever Adelaide looked down, another narrow piece of mutton disappeared from the edge of the plate. She assumed it had been eaten. Lucy arrived as the pudding was being brought in. Cold air followed her through the front door. Her coat was damp at the shoulders, and several strands of hair had loosened beneath her hat. She apologized first for the mud and then for the hour. The youngest class had left its copybooks in a dreadful state. Adelaide asked Nell to bring the covered plate from the kitchen. The gravy had thickened, and the potatoes had lost their warmth. Lucy removed her gloves, looked at the meal, and said it was very kind to have kept it. She ate several mouthfuls before setting down her fork. When the pudding was served, she accepted only a small piece and asked for tea. The pudding itself was faultless. Its surface was smooth, the currants evenly distributed, and the shape remained intact upon the dish. Adelaide could have shown it to the author of the cookery book without embarrassment. She tasted one spoonful, while watching Mrs. Vale press the softer center against the back of her spoon, and Lucy warm her hands around the teacup. By the time Adelaide returned her attention to her own plate, she could no longer have said whether the pudding contained too much suet or too little sugar. No one complained. Mrs. Vale praised the parsley upon the carrots. Lucy said the table looked handsome. The civility of both women allowed Adelaide to believe that the supper had been, with the exception of Lucy's lateness, entirely successful. Only after they had gone upstairs did she notice the small parcel beside Mrs. Vale's chair. 2 slices of mutton had been folded inside the corner of the napkin and hidden beneath the table edge. In the kitchen, Nell stood at the stone sink with a plate balanced in one hand. It held a cold potato, the end of the mutton, and a spoonful of pudding that had broken away when the dish was cleared. She ate between rinsing the serving spoons. "You need not stand," Adelaide said. Nell glanced at the table, which was crowded with bowls waiting to be washed. "I'm nearly finished." Adelaide looked at the orderly remains of the meal. The pudding had kept its shape. The portions had been sufficient. Supper had been served at the appointed time. Yet one woman had hidden her meat. Another had returned too late to enjoy it. And the person who helped prepare everything was eating beside the sink. Adelaide carried the plates to the work table and opened her notebook. The mutton required 7 minutes less in the oven. Lucy's portion should be placed nearer the range. Nell should be permitted 10 minutes between courses to eat. She wrote each correction carefully. The fault, Adelaide decided, had not been in the arrangement itself. The arrangement merely required greater precision. Over the next several mornings, the lower corners of the kitchen windows began to whiten before dawn. The frost never remained after the range was lit, but for an hour it traced small ferns upon the glass and turned the yard beyond into a pale, indistinct place. Adelaide's schedule also began to leave its mark upon Mallow House. Breakfast appeared at the same time each morning. The sheets were labelled by size. The loose edge of the blanket was mended. The receipts were divided into categories, and the softer apples had been separated from the sound ones. Nell no longer needed to ask what would be required for dinner, because the menu was pinned beside the dresser before she arrived. Some improvements were undeniable. Fewer candles were used. The pantry could be counted at a glance. and the coal merchant found Adelaide waiting beside the scales. Other matters remained less obedient. Lucy returned at a different hour each evening. Mrs. Vale sometimes asked for breakfast and then ate only the toast. Nell completed tasks in an order Adelaide had not assigned, usually because the kitchen itself seemed to suggest another sequence. A pan required soaking, the range drew suddenly, or the milk threatened to turn near the heat. Adelaide continued making corrections. She found the brown book while reorganizing the cupboard beside the range. The cupboard was deeper than it appeared. Behind the salt, tea and spice jars were 3 chipped pudding basins and a stack of cloths smelling faintly of flour. Adelaide removed everything, wiped the shelf, and reached into the dark space at the back. Her fingers met cloth where no cloth should have been. The book lay beneath an old wooden tray. Its covering might once have been green or red, but handling had reduced it to an uncertain brown. Its spine had been repaired with 2 kinds of thread, and several pages projected beyond the edges. "Does this belong to Mrs. Harrow?" Adelaide asked. Nell looked up from peeling turnips. "It belongs to the kitchen." The answer was not useful, though Nell appeared to consider it complete. Adelaide carried the book to the work table and opened it. The first pages contained ordinary household recipes: onion broth, seed cake, pickled walnuts, remedies for scorched milk, and instructions for preserving eggs through cold weather. Some had quantities, though the older entries relied upon cups, handfuls, and pieces the size of walnuts. Adelaide recognized Judith's writing beside several of them, correcting a temperature or noting the cupboard in which a particular pan was kept. Farther into the book, the pages became thicker from use. A few were translucent with old butter stains. Fine grains of sugar rested in the binding. One page opened more easily than the others, as though the book had been trained by many hands to return to it. At the top, in faded ink, were 2 words: winter pudding. Adelaide expected a list of ingredients beneath the title. Instead, she found 5 short lines: bread from the day before, milk enough, apples if the cellar has them, sweetness according to the table, spice according to the weather. She read the lines again. "Enough for what?" she asked. Nell glanced towards the page. "For the pudding, I suppose." "That is not a quantity." "No, miss." There was no mention of eggs, suet, cooking time, or the size of the basin. The instructions beneath were scarcely better. Soften the bread. Add what is needed. Mix until the spoon moves properly. Cook until the center is ready. Adelaide turned the page, expecting the complete version to continue upon the other side. She found only a recipe for cough syrup and a pressed bay leaf, brittle with age. She returned to the pudding. The margins were crowded with additions. They had been written in several inks and, Adelaide suspected, by several hands. Some leaned narrowly towards the binding. Others crossed the bottom of the page or fitted between the lines of the original entry. Add another egg if there are children at the table. Grate the apple when someone has weak teeth. Use less spice if the house has known sorrow that week. When snow is expected, make more than appears necessary. One note had been underlined twice. Always keep 1 portion beneath the cloth. Adelaide looked towards the covered bowl at the end of the table. Since arriving, she had seen bread dough rise beneath a cloth and pastry rest before rolling. But she had not seen Judith's particular pudding or a portion reserved in this manner. "For whom is the portion kept?" she asked. Nell's knife moved steadily through the turnip. "Whoever needs it." "Which person?" It was not always the same. Adelaide waited for a better explanation. None came. She examined the page more closely. There were no dates beside the notes, no initials, and no indication of which line should take precedence. A household with children might also contain someone with weak teeth. Snow could arrive during a week of sorrow. The cook would then be required to add an egg, grate the apple, reduce the spice, and increase a quantity that had never been stated in the first place. It was not a recipe. It was a collection of exceptions without a rule. Yet the page bore evidence of frequent use. A pale circle marked the place where a basin had once rested upon it. The lower corner had been turned so many times it felt soft as linen. Someone had drawn a small line beside the word apples, then another person had rubbed it nearly away. Adelaide carried the book to the window. The frost had vanished from the glass, leaving beads of water along the frame. In the clearer light, she could distinguish at least 3 forms of handwriting, perhaps more. One was firm and square, another was narrow, with long downward strokes. The most recent was certainly Judith's. None provided an ounce, a pint, or a reliable cooking time. At Cheltenham, Adelaide had kept recipes on separate cards. When a dish succeeded, she recorded the method. When it failed, she altered one element and tried again until the result could be depended upon. The winter pudding appeared to have accumulated uncertainty deliberately. She closed the book, then opened it once more at the same trained page. Nell gathered the turnip peelings into her apron. Mrs. Harrow made it whenever the cold stayed in the walls. Did she measure the ingredients? Nell considered. Not where I could see. That evening, after the accounts were finished, Adelaide placed the brown book beside her Cheltenham cookery volume. The contrast displeased her. One offered printed tables, tested proportions, and numbered instructions. The other offered weather, children, sorrow, and an unnamed person who might require a portion beneath a cloth. She drew a fresh page from her writing case and wrote "Winter Pudding" at the top. Beneath it she ruled columns for ingredient, weight, preparation, cooking time, and result. The old recipe might not contain a proper measure, but Adelaide believed one must exist. It had only been obscured by years of careless alteration. She sharpened her pencil, set the kitchen scales upon the table, and prepared to discover it. The rain changed while Adelaide was measuring the bread. It had begun as a fine tapping against the kitchen window, no heavier than the sound of fingernails upon glass. By the time she set the first weight upon the scales, small pellets of ice had appeared among the drops and were collecting along the outer sill. Nell paused beside the sink to look at them. "It will not settle," Adelaide said. "The ground is too wet." Nell returned to the carrots. Adelaide returned to the scales. She had spent 2 evenings comparing the brown book with 6 printed pudding recipes. From them, she had established a reasonable foundation: 12 ounces of stale bread, 1 pint of milk, 2 apples, 3 ounces of sugar, 1 egg, and a small quantity of suet to bind the mixture. Nutmeg appeared in 4 of the 6 printed versions, so she allowed half a teaspoon. The figures stood in a clean column upon the page she had ruled. Adelaide selected yesterday's loaf and cut away the crust. She weighed the soft center, added 2 narrow pieces when the balance fell short, then removed a corner when it tipped too far. The milk was measured in a marked jug. The apples were weighed before peeling and again afterwards so that the loss could be recorded. Mrs. Harrow never peeled those, Nell said. The skins would prevent an even texture. Nell gave the apples one final look and continued polishing the saucepan. The recipe in the brown book said only to soften the bread. Adelaide chose 15 minutes. She placed the basin beneath the clock, poured over the warmed milk, and covered it with a plate. While it rested, she grated the apples into uniform pieces and measured the sugar. The old note concerning weak teeth did not apply. No one in the house had asked for grated fruit. The note about children was equally irrelevant. The sky held sleet rather than snow, and Adelaide knew of no sorrow that had occurred during the week. This left the recipe free of exceptions. At the end of 15 minutes, she worked the bread with a fork until no separate pieces remained. She added the fruit, sugar, egg, suet, and nutmeg in order, recording the appearance after each addition. When the spoon met resistance, she noted that as well. The mixture filled the pudding basin to within an inch of the rim. Adelaide leveled the surface, covered it with buttered paper and cloth, then tied the string twice. She lowered the basin into simmering water and wrote down the hour. For the next 2.5 hours, the pudding remained steady beneath its lid while the sleet moved against the windows. The kitchen grew warmer and darker. Steam touched the copper pans, and the smell of apple and nutmeg gradually overcame the sharper scent of boiled cloth. Adelaide felt encouraged. Unlike the uncertain instructions in the brown book, the process had required no guessing. If the result succeeded, another person could reproduce it without having met Mrs. Vale, Lucy, Nell, or anyone who had once written in the margins. Shortly before supper, she lifted the basin from the water and allowed it to stand for 7 minutes. The pudding left the bowl cleanly when turned upon the dish. It was round, evenly colored, and firm enough to retain the shallow pattern impressed by the basin. Nell leaned closer. "It looks very proper," she said. Adelaide accepted this as praise. Mrs. Vale and Lucy were both present when supper began. Lucy had returned before the lamps were lit fully and sat near the fire while the feeling came back into her fingers. The earlier meal was a vegetable soup and soft rolls, chosen partly because Adelaide wished every appetite to be preserved for the pudding. When Nell placed it upon the table, Lucy smiled. "That smells like winter." The comment pleased Adelaide until Lucy added that the nutmeg reminded her of the school dining hall, where it was used heavily in nearly everything from custard to milk broth. Adelaide cut the pudding into 4 equal portions. 3 were placed upon warmed plates. The 4th she covered with a folded white cloth, following the underlined instruction in the old book. Mrs. Vale took a small spoonful. The outer part crumbled slightly beneath her spoon, while the center held together. "The flavor is very agreeable," she said. She ate slowly from the middle and left the firmer edge untouched. Lucy finished the apple pieces, but pushed some of the bread mixture beneath the remaining sauce. Neither woman asked for a second portion. Adelaide tasted her own serving with greater attention than she had given the currant pudding several evenings before. The ingredients were properly balanced. The apples retained some shape, the sugar was sufficient, and the nutmeg was noticeable without being bitter. Yet the pudding required more effort to swallow than its appearance suggested. The bread had absorbed the measured milk completely, leaving nothing to keep it soft as it cooled. No one called it dry. Mrs. Vale praised the apples. Lucy admired the neatness of the slices. Their kindness was so carefully directed towards what had succeeded that Adelaide understood what they were avoiding. Nell cleared the table. In the kitchen, she collected a spoonful of sauce from the bottom of the jug and poured it over the fragment that had broken from Mrs. Vale's serving. Was Mrs. Harrow's pudding softer? Adelaide asked. Nell considered the question while carrying the plates to the sink. Usually. How much milk did she use? Sometimes more, sometimes less. On what basis? Nell looked towards the brown book. I never knew her to measure the basis. Adelaide removed the cloth from the reserved portion. It remained warm beneath the covering. She expected Nell to take it, but the girl had already begun eating the scraps beside the sink and did not look towards the plate. For whom did Mrs. Harrow keep this? Adelaide asked. It depended who came. No one came that evening. The church bell sounded through the hardening rain. Mrs. Vale retired early. Lucy carried her copybooks upstairs, and Nell left by the back door with her scarf tied closely beneath her chin. The untouched portion remained under its cloth at the end of the kitchen table. Adelaide completed the accounts, checked the lower damper, and examined the pudding once more before going upstairs. Its edges had already begun to lose their softness. She placed a plate over it, though she did not expect the covering to improve it. By morning, the sleet had melted from the sill. The reserved pudding had dried to a firm, pale wedge. Adelaide pressed it with the back of a spoon and watched the surface resist. She opened her ruled page. Beside milk, she crossed out 1 pint and wrote 1 pint, 2 ounces. Beside cooking time, she reduced the steaming by 10 minutes. The apple could remain unchanged. The nutmeg might be lowered slightly for Lucy, although this was a preference rather than a fault in the recipe. Adelaide entered every correction in clear figures. The first experiment had not failed. It had produced information. The proper measure was still there, waiting to be found. The light withdrew earlier from the kitchen each afternoon. By the time Nell carried the tea tray upstairs, the window above the sink had become a dark square, reflecting the copper pans and Adelaide's lamp more clearly than the yard beyond it. Adelaide began reading the brown book after the supper dishes were put away. At first, she intended only to find further information about the winter pudding. Someone, at some point, must have known a successful proportion. Adelaide expected to uncover it in another entry or upon a loose page. Instead, she found more handwriting. The oldest hand was broad and square, written in ink, faded to the color of weak tea. Its notes sometimes traveled up the side of a page and continued across the top. A second hand was smaller and more hurried. It shortened common words, omitted punctuation, and pressed entire observations into narrow spaces between recipes. A third appeared only in pencil and had nearly vanished wherever fingers had touched the paper. A younger, rounder hand recorded small domestic failures without embarrassment: burned onions, unset jelly, and bread forgotten beside the range. It appeared in the kitchen for only a few years. The most familiar writing belonged to Judith. Adelaide recognized the firm rightward slope from her aunt's letters and from the labels attached to the keys. Judith had added corrections to nearly every part of the book, but seldom crossed out what another person had written. She placed her own words beside the older ones, as though disagreement did not require removal. Adelaide did not approve of this method. A corrected instruction should replace an incorrect one. Otherwise, the same mistake remained available to be repeated. The winter pudding page contained all 5 hands. She copied the notes onto separate sheets, grouping them by subject. Ingredients occupied 1 page. Cooking methods occupied another. Instructions concerning weather were placed together, though they still offered little practical use. A 4th sheet was reserved for references to particular people. That sheet filled most quickly. Grate the apple for Mrs. Bell. No cloves while the baby sleeps poorly. More milk when the schoolmistress has been coughing. 2 additional portions while the road is being repaired. Let the kitchen girl sit before it grows cold. There were other names without explanation. Mrs. Grove, little Harriet, Mr. Finch with the injured hand, the 2 sisters from Cirencester, and someone called only Aunt May, who apparently disliked raisins but enjoyed currants. Adelaide searched the household ledger for the names. Judith's accounts went back many years, but Mrs. Bell did not appear among the recent guests, nor did Harriet, Aunt May, or the sisters from Cirencester. The notes must have been written for people no longer connected with Mallow House. This made them even less suitable as instructions. The following evening, Adelaide tried to determine whether one handwriting offered a more dependable version than the others. The broad hand preferred apples and little spice. The narrow hand often increased the milk. Judith added eggs more freely than either. The pencil notes reduced sugar and occasionally replaced it with preserved fruit. None remained consistent. Adelaide turned to Nell, who was folding the dry kitchen cloths into a basket. Was Mrs. Bell a guest here? Nell considered the name. Before my time. Do you know why her apples were grated? Perhaps she liked them that way. The note does not say that she liked them. It simply gives an instruction. Nell aligned the final cloth with the others. Then whoever wrote it must have known. It was another answer that satisfied Nell, while leaving Adelaide with the entire question. The brown book nevertheless began to occupy more of her attention. She carried it into the dining room during the quiet interval before supper and compared the handwriting beneath the clearer light. She found a scrap of lace marking a recipe for barley water, a child's small drawing of a spoon on the back of a preserve label, and a brown ring where a teacup had once been set down, too close to the writing. The book had not been kept carefully, yet it had been kept for a very long time. Its pages held no grand family events. There were no records of births, marriages, or deaths. The lives preserved in it appeared through smaller needs. Someone unable to tolerate cloves, someone requiring more milk, someone arriving after the usual hour, someone who needed food soft enough to eat without difficulty. Adelaide understood that these details had once mattered. She did not understand why they had been allowed to obscure the recipe itself. She decided to write to Judith. Her first draft listed every contradiction. When Adelaide read it again, the letter sounded less like a request than a report Upon the failures of Judith's kitchen, she began a second version. Dear Aunt Judith, I have found the brown household book in the cupboard beside the range. I am attempting to put the winter pudding into a form that may be followed reliably. Before making further trials, would you kindly tell me which entry represents the original recipe and what quantities you generally used? She added brief news of Mrs. Vale, Lucy, Nell, and the weather, then sent the letter with the village post. During the days that followed, Cresswell altered quietly. The baker tied holly above his doorway, a bundle of evergreen appeared around the church notice board, and children carrying hymn sheets passed Mallow House in the late afternoon. Their voices could be heard from the lane before the darkness concealed them. Adelaide made no second pudding while waiting. She continued reading the margins. One note troubled her more than the rest. It had been written in pencil beside Judith's instruction to add milk. Do not ask whether she wants it softer. She will say it is no trouble as it is. No name followed. The sentence did not explain who she was or why she would refuse. Adelaide copied it onto the sheet of references to people, though it seemed to belong equally to cooking method. Judith's reply arrived with the bread delivery. The envelope contained a single sheet and no account of her health, beyond the statement that the baths were disagreeable but useful. Regarding the pudding, she had written only 2 sentences. There was never only one table, so there could never be only one measure. If you wish to understand the book, Adelaide, begin with the chairs rather than the scales. Adelaide placed the letter beside the brown volume. The first sentence was imprecise. The second was worse. Chairs possessed no measurable connection to milk, bread, apples, or cooking time, except in determining the number of portions, and even that could be achieved by counting people directly. She had asked for a quantity. Judith had sent her a metaphor. From the dining room came the faint sound of Mrs. Vale moving her knife through the soft bread Adelaide had begun serving with soup. Near the back door, Nell's kitchen chair remained pushed beneath the wall, where it had stood unused since morning. Lucy's place was set, though no one yet knew when she would return. Adelaide looked from Judith's letter to the 3 chairs beyond the open doorway. Then she closed the brown book, not because she had finished with it, but because supper required her attention. Judith's letter remained beside the brown book for 3 days. Adelaide did not agree that chairs could explain a recipe. Nevertheless, she found herself noticing them. Mrs. Vale's chair was nearest the fire and slightly lower than the others, its cushion flattened by long use. Lucy stood beside the window, where the last daylight was useful when she brought copybooks to supper. Adelaide's own chair faced the kitchen door, allowing her to see when Nell entered with a dish or when the kettle required attention. Nell's chair was not in the dining room at all. It stood against the kitchen wall, beneath a row of aprons, usually holding a basket, folded cloths or vegetables waiting to be sorted. Adelaide began with Mrs. Vale. At breakfast, she watched the older woman break toast into her tea before eating it. At dinner, Mrs. Vale pressed boiled potato into gravy until it was nearly smooth. She never requested a different dish. When asked whether a meal suited her, she always replied that it was very good and that Adelaide must not trouble herself. The penciled note returned to Adelaide. Do not ask whether she wants it softer. She will say it is no trouble as it is. The next evening, Adelaide prepared leeks and potatoes in broth. Her schedule allowed 40 minutes for simmering. When that time had passed, she tested a piece of leek and found it cooked. Then she looked towards Mrs. Vale's chair, lowered the flame, and left the pot for another 15 minutes. The vegetables lost their neat edges. The potatoes partly dissolved into the broth, making it thicker than Adelaide had planned. Mrs. Vale finished the bowl. She did not praise the softness. She spoke instead about the church organ, which had been played badly during the children's rehearsal. The empty bowl remained before her while she described 3 notes that should never have been permitted to follow one another. Adelaide entered no correction in her notebook. She only placed the bowl with the others. Lucy required a different kind of observation. Her late returns did not follow a pattern Adelaide could place upon a timetable. Sometimes she arrived directly after the school bell. On other evenings she remained until the youngest pupils had been collected, the stove had been banked, or a stack of writing had been corrected. By then her gloves were cold, and she often said she had lost her appetite. Adelaide had been keeping Lucy's meal covered in the dining room. The plates retained little heat, and the gravy formed a skin before Lucy reached the table. One afternoon, Adelaide left a small pan of soup at the side of the range instead. She placed the bread beneath a cloth and did not set Lucy's place. When Lucy returned, she entered the parlor, expecting apologies to be required. "I am later than I meant to be. The soup has not noticed," Adelaide said. Lucy looked uncertain, then smiled. She removed her damp coat, sat beside the fire for several minutes, and ate in the kitchen when the soup had been warmed through. The meal did not delay anyone else, and Lucy did not have to hurry in order to prevent it becoming colder. On the following evening, Adelaide did the same without explaining it. Nell was more difficult because she had learned to disappear during meals. She carried dishes into the dining room, returned to the kitchen, and filled every interval with another task. While soup was being eaten, she sliced bread. During the main course, she washed the first pan. By the time the pudding plates came back, she had collected a meal from whatever remained and eaten half of it beside the sink. "You have 10 minutes between courses," Adelaide reminded her. "Yes, miss." Nell used the 10 minutes to polish the stove door. The next day, Adelaide cleared the basket from the kitchen chair. She wiped the seat and placed it beside the corner of the work table. Before dinner, she set a plate there containing stew, bread, and a spoon. Nell stopped when she saw it. "Is someone expected?" "You are. I can eat after, miss. The stew will be less satisfactory after." Nell sat, though only upon the front edge of the chair. She ate quickly at first, listening for movement in the dining room. No bell rang. Mrs. Vale and Adelaide required nothing. Gradually Nell's spoon slowed. She remained seated for 6 minutes. Adelaide did not point out that 4 minutes had been left unused. These adjustments were not entered upon the weekly schedule. They could not be. Mrs. Vale did not require every vegetable to be cooked for the same additional time. Lucy was not late every evening. Nell's work did not always allow 6 uninterrupted minutes at the same point in a meal. Adelaide began to understand why some household knowledge resisted columns. She did not yet accept that this made the columns unnecessary. There were still accounts to balance, coal to measure, and linen to turn. Her schedule prevented waste and ensured the work was completed. But beside it, another form of order was becoming visible, one that changed according to the person standing in the doorway or sitting beside the fire. The brown book remained open more often upon the work table. Adelaide did not attempt another winter pudding. Instead, she tested its instructions against ordinary meals. Sweetness, according to the table, began to seem less foolish when Lucy accepted jam after a difficult day at school, but declined it when the children had pleased her. Spice, according to the weather, made a certain practical sense when the smell of cloves filled the kitchen pleasantly on a dry, cold morning, and seemed oppressive when rain kept every window closed. She still wanted quantities. She simply no longer believed quantities would be sufficient. The least comfortable discovery concerned her own chair. One afternoon, while preparing pastry, Adelaide noticed her hands had begun to tremble slightly as she rolled the dough. She assumed the kitchen was colder than usual and poured tea. The first mouthful made her aware that she had eaten nothing since a piece of toast before sunrise. Breakfast had been interrupted by the coal delivery. At dinner, Mrs. Vale required a fresh cloth after spilling tea. Adelaide had carried her own plate to the kitchen and later found it untouched beneath a covered dish. She stood beside the range with the teacup in one hand and a strip of uncooked pastry in the other. No one had prevented her from eating. No unexpected guest had taken her portion. She had simply removed herself from the count as each new task appeared. Adelaide ate bread and cheese at the work table. She did not sit. The action was too brief to feel like a change, and too necessary to be called indulgence. Still, when she finished, she left the plate where she could see it, rather than hiding it beneath the washing. That evening, Mrs. Vale's vegetables were soft enough. Lucy's soup waited near the range. Nell sat for 7 minutes upon the kitchen chair. The dining room remained orderly, though the chairs were no longer at equal distances. Lucy had moved hers nearer the fire. Mrs. Vale's cushion had been turned. Adelaide's chair stood slightly back from the table because she had risen to fetch more bread and had not corrected it. No one remarked upon these irregularities. The plates, Adelaide noticed as she gathered them, were empty. The singing from the church had become part of the late afternoon. At first, the children's voices had arrived separately along Mill Lane, uncertain and easily scattered by the wind. As the rehearsals continued, they began to hold together. Adelaide could recognize the same hymn returning each evening while she prepared supper, growing steadier as the windows darkened. Mrs. Martha Webb came for the household washing while the final verse was being repeated. She was a broad, capable woman with a red wool scarf and hands made pale by years of hot water. Twice each week, she collected the sheets, towels, and table linen from Mallow House, carrying them away in a wicker hamper balanced against one hip. Adelaide knew her principally through the numbered laundry list, which Mrs. Webb always returned without error. That afternoon, the brown book lay open upon the work table. Mrs. Webb set down the empty hamper and stopped before it. "Judith has let you find that, then. It was behind the pudding basins. That is where it has always lived." Adelaide turned the book so the winter pudding page faced her. "Do you know who wrote these notes?" Mrs. Webb removed her gloves before touching the paper. She did not begin with the oldest writing. Her fingers settled upon the small, hurried hand squeezed between two lines near the binding. "My mother." The answer was so immediate that Adelaide looked at the woman's face for confirmation. Mrs. Webb smiled faintly. She never left enough room the first time. She wrote shopping lists in the same fashion, then put the last 3 items up the side. The broad square hand belonged to Mrs. Webb's grandmother, who had worked at Mallow House when coaches still stopped on the road beyond Cresswell. The nearly vanished pencil marks had been made by a kitchen assistant named Eliza Grove. The rounded hand belonged to Judith's younger sister, who kept house for several winters before marrying and moving towards Gloucester. Judith's writing, of course, required no identification. Adelaide drew out the sheets upon which she had copied and classified the notes. Mrs. Webb read them slowly. Her expression changed at several names, not with surprise but recognition. "Mrs. Bell," Adelaide said. "Was she a guest?" "For 11 years. The room Mrs. Vale uses was hers before that." "Why were her apples grated?" Mrs. Webb glanced up. Because she had lost most of her teeth and would not admit that the pieces troubled her. The explanation was simple enough to have been written beside the instruction, yet no one had written it. The woman at the stove had apparently known, and knowledge had been considered sufficient. Mrs. Webb moved to another note. "No cloves while the baby sleeps poorly." This had been written during a winter when a young mother stayed at Mallow House while her husband repaired the roof of their cottage. The infant slept during the day and cried through the night. Strong kitchen smells made the mother ill when she was tired, so the cloves were left out. "The baby did not eat the pudding," Adelaide said. "No, his mother did." Adelaide looked again at the sentence. She had assumed every instruction referred to the person named within it. The note had been concerned with someone not mentioned at all. "More milk when the schoolmistress has been coughing" belonged to a season when cold passed through the village school and then through nearly every house. The pudding was softened because several guests had sore throats and little appetite. The schoolmistress had merely been the first. The additional portions for the road repairs were intended for men who arrived wet at the back door after working upon the flooded bridge. They were not boarders, but Judith's mother had fed them until the road opened again. Mrs. Webb spoke without ceremony. These were not grand acts in her telling. They were adjustments made because someone had been cold, tired, unable to chew, disturbed by a smell, or unexpectedly present when supper was served. Adelaide turned several pages. One pencil entry instructed the cook to use preserved plums in place of sugar. She had placed it among the less reliable variations. There was little money that winter, Mrs. Webb explained. The sugar jar was nearly empty before the cold weather ended. Why continue making pudding? There was bread. There were plums. People still expected something warm after supper. The dish had retained its name even when several of its usual ingredients were absent. No announcement had been made that it was a poorer version. The cook used what remained and served it in the familiar basin. Adelaide turned back to the first page of the recipe. Which of these women wrote the original? Mrs. Webb sat upon Nell's kitchen chair. She considered the question carefully enough that Adelaide expected at last to receive the answer Judith had withheld. None of them, I should think. Then it predates your grandmother. Not exactly. Mrs. Webb explained that her grandmother had first encountered something similar at another lodging house. Stale bread softened with milk, fruit added when available, then steamed near the range. But there had been no written recipe. Upon coming to Mallow House, she recorded what she remembered. The first version in the book was therefore already an alteration. Later cooks added eggs when the house could afford them, apples when the orchard yielded well, suet when the weather was severe, and preserves when fresh fruit was gone. The cooking vessel changed, so did the number of people at the table. The pudding had never passed through 2 winters in precisely the same form. But surely there was a version from which the others departed, Adelaide said. Only the version made the time before. Mrs. Webb's answer was gentle, but it left no place for the original Adelaide had been seeking. The broad handwriting was not a foundation. The smaller notes were not corruptions. No careless generation had obscured a perfect measure. Each woman had received a method already shaped by another kitchen and made it suitable for the household before her. It was not a recipe altered by women who had failed to preserve it. It was a recipe composed of alterations. Mrs. Webb began counting the sheets and pillowcases. Adelaide folded the brown book closed, then opened it once more. The page appeared different, without a single word having changed. Its lack of quantities no longer seemed entirely empty. The space had allowed each cook to look beyond the book. Judith never explained this, Adelaide said. She would not. Why? Mrs. Webb placed the final towel in the hamper. She says explanations given too soon are only another sort of instruction. Adelaide could hear her aunt's manner in the sentence, and suspected it had been repeated exactly. After Mrs. Webb left, the kitchen settled around the absence of her voice. The hymn rehearsal had ended. Damp wheel marks from the laundry hamper remained upon the floor, and the lamp made a quiet circle upon the work table. Adelaide looked at the ruled recipe beside the brown book. 12 ounces of bread, 1 pint and 2 ounces of milk, 2 apples, 3 ounces of sugar, every quantity clear and repeatable. She did not tear it up. She folded it once and placed it inside her Cheltenham cookery book, where it could remain useful for what it was, the record of 1 pudding made for 1 table on 1 evening. Then she returned the brown book to the center of the work table rather than the cupboard. For the first time, Adelaide did not ask it how much she should use. She wondered instead who would be sitting down when the pudding was served. Adelaide chose an evening when no one was expected to be late. Lucy had left the schoolhouse with the last pupil and returned while a little colour remained above the rooftops. Mrs. Vale had spent the afternoon in the parlour and said her appetite was better. Nell had finished the heavier kitchen work before the lamps were required. The house, for once, offered a table that could be counted in advance. Adelaide placed the brown book open beside the mixing bowl. Her ruled recipe remained folded within the Cheltenham volume on the dresser. The scales stayed in their cupboard. This did not mean she intended to proceed carelessly. The loaf was older and drier than the one used before, so it would require more milk. Adelaide broke enough into the bowl for 4 portions and the reserved piece beneath the cloth, then added 1 more slice. Nell watched from the sink. "You have not weighed it. I am aware of that." The answer sounded sharper than Adelaide intended. She softened it by asking Nell to bring 2 apples from the tray near the cellar wall. The apples were unequal. On another day, Adelaide would have chosen matching fruits. Instead, she peeled both, removed the bruised part, and grated them finely. The old instruction had been written for Mrs. Bell, not Mrs. Vale. Yet Adelaide had watched Mrs. Vale leave the firmer apple pieces untouched. The name in the book belonged to the past. The need was present again. Warm milk was poured over the bread until the lower pieces disappeared beneath it. Adelaide waited, then moved the spoon through the mixture. It resisted near the center. She added another small amount without measuring. Sweetness according to the table. Lucy had eaten jam and a sugared bun that day. Mrs. Vale preferred little sweetness. Nell enjoyed what remained at the bottom of the preserving jar. Adelaide allowed 2 modest spoonfuls, then half of another. Spice according to the weather. The evening was cold but dry. Adelaide grated only enough nutmeg to warm the apples and added cinnamon because Nell said Judith used it when the fruit lacked flavor. 1 egg was sufficient. The mixture moved beneath the spoon without becoming heavy. Adelaide stopped stirring when it looked ready, though she could not have entered that appearance in a column. Which basin? Nell asked. Adelaide considered the 2 upon the shelf. Her exact pudding had filled the taller basin perfectly. This mixture, made for an additional person, required the wider one with the chipped rim. She buttered the basin, spooned in the mixture, and covered it. The surface was not completely level. A ridge remained where the last spoonful fell, but Adelaide did not disturb it. The pudding went into the steaming pot, while the household ate a plain supper of chicken broth, soft vegetables, and bread. Nell had a bowl in the kitchen and used the chair for 7 minutes. Adelaide knew because she noticed the church clock, though she did not record the time. When the pudding was ready, it did not leave the basin as cleanly as the first. One edge held for a moment and then released, causing the pudding to settle slightly towards one side. Its surface was darker near the rim, and several strands of grated apple could be seen where they had browned. "Shall I turn it again?" Nell asked. "No, it would still be the same pudding." Adelaide prepared a thin sauce from milk and preserved apple syrup. There was less milk than she had expected. The sauce would not thicken properly without using what had been set aside for breakfast, and she chose not to use it. Before Nell carried the pudding in, Adelaide went to the dining room. Mrs. Vale's place stood near the fire. Lucy's chair had already been moved away from the window. Adelaide set her own plate opposite them. Then she brought a 4th chair from the kitchen and placed it at the end of the table. She added a plate, spoon, and folded napkin. Nell entered with the pudding and stopped. "Is someone coming? You are already here." Nell looked at Mrs. Vale and Lucy, then back towards the kitchen. "I have my bowl by the range. For the broth, not the pudding. I can take some after." Adelaide removed the cloth from the sauce jug. "It will be cold after." No further argument was offered. Nell set down the dish and sat upon the 4th chair with the same caution she had shown when Adelaide first cleared the kitchen seat for her. Mrs. Vale moved the water jug so Nell could reach it. Lucy asked whether the village baker truly put dried orange peel into his Christmas buns, or whether the flavor came only from spice. Nell, whose sister worked 2 mornings a week at the bakery, knew that he used both. The pudding was cut into 5 unequal portions. Mrs. Vale received the soft center. Lucy's piece came from the side with less browned apple. Nell was given the portion nearest her before she could say she wanted only a little. Adelaide covered the 5th serving with a clean cloth and placed it on the sideboard. The sauce was thinner than intended, but it soaked easily into the pudding. Mrs. Vale finished her portion without pressing it repeatedly against the spoon. Lucy remarked that the nutmeg was present, but did not taste of school. Nell ate slowly enough for the others to finish before her. Adelaide's own piece was slightly darker at one edge, and sweeter where the preserved syrup had collected. It tasted of bread, warm apple, and something less definite that came from the cinnamon. It did not resemble the exact pudding, closely enough to be considered an improved version of it. It was simply the pudding required that evening. Conversation continued after the plates were empty. Lucy spoke about a pupil who had written that every bird in England migrated to the same tree. Nell explained that the girl's father had recently planted 3 pear trees. Adelaide did not guide the exchange. She sat with her hands around the warm teacup and allowed the voices to pass across the uneven distances between the chairs. Later, when the room had emptied, she examined what remained. 4 plates required no scraping. The sauce jug was empty. Nell's napkin lay folded beside her spoon rather than abandoned in the kitchen. Under the cloth on the sideboard, the 5th portion remained soft. The pudding had leaned to one side. Its sauce had been too thin. Its ingredients could not have been reproduced from memory in exact ounces. Adelaide carried the reserved portion into the kitchen and set it beneath the lamp. For the first time, the absence of a proper measure did not seem like the absence of a result. A skin of ice appeared upon the village pond. It was too thin to bear even the weight of a fallen twig, and by midday it broke into dark pieces near the reeds. Still, its presence changed the morning. Children stopped beside the wall on their way to school. The milk cart travelled more slowly down Mill Lane, and every gate latch felt colder beneath the hand. At Mallow House, the reserved portion of winter pudding remained under its cloth. Adelaide had made the pudding on a quiet evening, when every person expected at supper had been present. There had been no uncertainty about chairs, yet the brown book had still instructed the cook to keep one serving aside. No one came to the door. Lucy did not return downstairs. Mrs. Vale did not ask for more. Nell had eaten at the table and left with no backward glance towards the sideboard. The portion, therefore, seemed to have no purpose. Adelaide placed a plate over it before going to bed. In the morning it was still soft enough to eat, but she did not eat it. Nell warmed it beside the range and took it home for her younger brother. The food was not wasted. That did not answer the question. When Mrs. Webb next came for the washing, Adelaide asked why the portion was kept. Mrs. Webb removed a damp tablecloth from the basket and considered it against the window light before answering. For someone arriving late, often enough. But the instruction says always. The postman used to come after the hill route when the weather was bad. Judith's mother gave it to him. And when the postman did not come, there might be a traveller, or one of the children would wake hungry. Sometimes a guest who refused pudding at supper thought better of it before bed. Each answer supplied another possible recipient, but not a dependable one. "What happened if no one wanted it?" Adelaide asked. Mrs. Webb folded the tablecloth once and placed it with the sheets. Then it waited until morning. The reply appeared incomplete. Adelaide recognized the manner now. It was the manner of women who had lived with the brown book long enough to stop considering its uncertainties defects. That afternoon, she returned to the winter pudding page. Always keep one portion beneath the cloth. The sentence had been underlined twice. The first line was faded brown, the second darker and less steady. At the edge of the paper, where the final word approached the binding, a small mark descended towards the back of the book. Adelaide followed it with her finger. The rear cover was thicker than the front. She had assumed this came from a repair to the cloth, but when she pressed near the corner, the surface shifted. 2 pieces of paper had been pasted together and then attached to the board. She carried the book nearer the steaming kettle, holding it above the warmth. Without allowing the paper to grow damp, she softened the old paste. The top sheet lifted slowly beneath the blade of a table knife. Writing appeared underneath. The hidden page was not a separate recipe. It contained several brief household notes in the broad square hand Mrs. Webb had identified as belonging to her grandmother. Most concerned ordinary provisions: salt to be ordered before the road flooded, the blue bowl unsuitable for hot milk, flour stored too near the wall. Near the bottom was a sentence written more carefully than the rest: keep 1 portion for whoever has not yet been counted. Adelaide read it several times. The wording explained the postman, the traveller, the hungry child, and the guest who changed her mind. A person did not need to be expected in order to require a place in the meal. The portion preserved the possibility that the count had been incomplete. Beneath the sentence, in the narrow handwriting of Mrs. Webb's mother, another line had been added: and if no one comes, it belongs to the woman who made it. She must also be counted. Adelaide sat down upon the kitchen chair. The discovery was not dramatic. Nothing in the room altered. The kettle continued its low beginning sound, and water from the vegetables dripped into the sink. Yet the second sentence seemed to turn every earlier instruction towards a place Adelaide had not looked. The women who made the pudding had not merely been preserving a portion for strangers. They had been preserving it against their own habit of disappearance. Adelaide thought of Nell eating beside the sink. She thought of Judith's notes, written after everyone else had gone to bed. Then she remembered years at Cheltenham, in which she had arranged trays, cut bread, poured tea, and carried her own plate away untouched, because some small duty had arisen. No one had ordered her to do this. The household had praised her efficiency. Guests remarked that she appeared never to tire. She had accepted these observations as proof that she performed her work well. To admit hunger, fatigue, or the need to sit would have introduced an inconvenience into a system she had been employed to keep free of them. The cook, the companion, the woman with the keys, each could pass through the count without entering it. The hidden note had anticipated this. It did not advise the cook to take whatever remained after morning. It said the portion belonged to her, not as waste, not as indulgence, but because she was already among the people for whom the food had been made. That evening, Adelaide prepared another winter pudding. She did not change the method greatly. Mrs. Vale still needed grated apple. Lucy preferred little nutmeg. Nell sat at the table for the pudding course, though she continued to look towards the kitchen whenever a board creaked. Adelaide cut 5 portions. 4 were eaten. The 5th was covered with the clean white cloth and placed upon the sideboard. The house settled early. Lucy went upstairs with her copybooks. Mrs. Vale retired with a volume of music. Nell carried her scarf and gloves through the back door. The lane remained quiet, and no footsteps approached the gate. Adelaide washed the plates, wiped the table, and checked the lower damper. She completed the accounts. Twice, she looked at the covered portion and found reasons to leave it there a little longer. At last, the church clock sounded the hour. No one had come. Adelaide lifted the cloth. The pudding retained warmth at its center. She poured the last of the sauce over it, carried the plate to the kitchen table, and sat down. Not at the edge, as Nell had done during her first meals, but with the chair drawn fully beneath her. She poured tea into an ordinary cup. The fine cup used in the dining room had already been washed, and for once, Adelaide did not consider reopening the cupboard to fetch it. The pudding was not the best portion. One edge had browned more than the rest, and the sauce had thickened while waiting. It was nevertheless warm, sweet, and sufficient. Adelaide ate without balancing the accounts or planning breakfast. When a small piece remained, she finished it because she wanted it, not because waste must be prevented. The empty plate stood before her upon the marked oak table. For years, Adelaide had believed that good household management meant counting everything accurately. Only now was she beginning to understand how easily the person doing the counting could leave herself out. The morning gave its warning before the first flake fell. Smoke from the chimneys remained low over Cresswell instead of rising above the roofs. Sparrows gathered beneath the eaves of Mallow House, quarreling over places sheltered from the wind. The sky had lost the separate forms of cloud and become one pale surface, almost white enough to reflect light upon the upper windows. The milkman stamped his boots at the back door and advised Nell to fill every jug. "The hill road will be gone by afternoon," he said. "Not gone truly, but no one will see where it is." Adelaide ordered an additional quart. The man shook his head. His remaining cans had already been promised along the lane, and the mare was impatient to begin the climb before the weather changed. She accepted the usual amount and entered it in the ledger. The day's meals had been planned for 4 people. A vegetable pie would provide supper, with the remaining chicken broth thinned for a first course. There was enough stale bread for winter pudding, 1 egg, a little milk, and several apples nearing the end of their usefulness. It was a modest menu but sufficient. The first flakes appeared while Adelaide was rolling the pastry. They were sparse and dry, moving sideways past the kitchen window without settling. Nell said the ground was too damp. Adelaide had said the same about the sleet some days earlier, and then had been correct. This time neither of them repeated the prediction. By noon, white had gathered along the stone wall. The yard pump wore a narrow cap of snow, and the dark marks of Nell's shoes filled almost as soon as she made them. Lucy returned before the school's usual closing hour. 2 girls stood beside her beneath the porch, holding hands inside matching brown mittens. The elder, Elsie Gibbons, was perhaps 9. Her sister May was smaller and had snow caught in the wool around her bonnet. Their boots were wet, but they were not frightened. The unexpected freedom from afternoon lessons had given the weather the quality of an adventure. Lucy explained that their parents had traveled to the market town that morning. A message had reached the school to say they would remain at the inn beyond the ridge until the roads were cleared. "The girls are to stay with me," Lucy said. "I thought Mallow House would be warmer than the schoolroom." Adelaide looked at the 2 additional pairs of boots upon the mat. "Of course." The answer arrived before she had calculated anything. Only after Nell had taken the girls to the kitchen fire did Adelaide remember the single egg and the vegetable pie intended for 4. She brought down 2 blankets from the linen cupboard and arranged the unoccupied room beside Lucy's. The smaller bed had no hot water bottle, so she filled a stone jar and wrapped it in flannel. From upstairs, she could hear the children describing to Mrs. Vale how the snow had erased the lines in the schoolyard. Before Adelaide returned to the kitchen, the front knocker sounded again. Miss Ruth Cole stood outside with a carpet bag, a round hat box, and snow upon the shoulders of her travelling cloak. She was a milliner who stayed at Mallow House several times each year, while visiting customers in the surrounding villages. Judith's ledger listed her as preferring the small room above the parlour and tea, without milk. The coach had stopped at Cresswell rather than attempt the Eastern Road. Miss Cole had expected to arrive the following evening and apologized for appearing before her reservation. "The room is ready," Adelaide said. This was true because Adelaide kept every unused room ready. Nell carried the carpet bag upstairs. The hat box remained near the hall table, beaded with melting snow. Adelaide placed a 5th mark beside supper in her notebook, then corrected it to 7 when she included the children. She had not yet included Nell. The omission became visible as soon as it was written. Adelaide added an 8th mark. Snow continued to thicken against the lower windows. Mill Lane lost its colour. The baker's holly, the gateposts and the pump all became shapes beneath the same white covering. Mrs. Webb arrived with the clean laundry shortly after the church clock struck in the afternoon. She had crossed the low bridge before the stones disappeared, but the path towards her cottage lay through an open field where the wind was already moving the snow into deeper ridges. "I shall wait half an hour," she said. The half-hour passed. The field became less visible. Adelaide prepared the small, unoccupied room on the first floor without asking Mrs. Webb to reconsider the journey. The laundry woman accepted the arrangement with equal practicality and hung her red scarf beside the range to dry. There were now 9 people in Mallow House. A boy from the posting inn came to the gate before darkness. He carried a written message confirming that the Gibbonses were safe. The coach passengers had found rooms, and no one should attempt the ridge until morning. Adelaide gave him hot broth in a cup and bread wrapped in paper before he returned to the inn. The message removed the only uncertainty that mattered. The girls knew their parents were safe. Miss Cole's luggage was upstairs. Mrs. Webb had a bed. The house held enough coal, blankets and candles. Only supper remained unresolved. Adelaide went to the pantry. The vegetable pie could not be divided into 9 useful portions. The chicken broth would stretch with water, but not far enough to serve as the greater part of the meal. There were potatoes and onions, though cooking them would take time. Bread remained, but most was dry. The milk jug was less than half full after the children's tea. In the wire basket lay 1 egg. Adelaide carried the pantry list to the kitchen table and began calculating. If she reduced each slice of pie, added potatoes, and served more bread, the meal might appear sufficient. Yet the children had eaten little since morning. Miss Cole had travelled in the cold. Mrs. Webb had walked through snow carrying linen. Lucy had given her own bun to May before reaching the house. Equal portions would not be equal needs. The thought disturbed the figures before Adelaide finished them. She looked towards the dining room. Extra chairs had already been brought from the parlour and placed along the walls. 2 school cloaks steamed near the fire. Mrs. Vale was showing Elsie how to wind grey wool without tightening it. Lucy sat upon the carpet, fastening May's loose boot button. Miss Cole had opened her hat box to prove that the paper flowers inside had survived the journey. In the kitchen, Nell and Mrs. Webb peeled potatoes side by side without having been asked. The scene was orderly, in no manner Adelaide would once have recognized. Wet gloves occupied the mantel. A blanket lay across the sofa. Teacups did not match, and the chairs had been drawn wherever warmth could be found. Everyone, however, had a place. Adelaide returned to the pantry list. The single egg stood at the center of the page, as though the entire supper depended upon it. Her first impulse was to blame herself for failing to prepare. The milkman had warned her. The sky had given it signs. A capable housekeeper should have known how many provisions winter might require. Then she remembered the brown book. It lay upon the work table beneath Judith's letter. Adelaide opened it to the trained page and found the line written across the lower margin. When snow is expected, make more than appears necessary. She had once dismissed the instruction because it contained no quantity. Now no fixed quantity could help her. The table that had been planned for 4 had become a table for 9, between breakfast and darkness. Adelaide rested one hand upon the page. She did not reach for the scales. She turned instead towards the people gathered in the kitchen and began, silently, to count the chairs. There were 8 chairs. Adelaide counted them twice before understanding why her notebook said 9. She had included the boy from the posting inn when he arrived with the message, then forgotten to remove his mark after giving him broth and sending him back. The error did not trouble her, as it once might have done. The boy had been present. He had been cold and hungry. For the short time he stood in the kitchen, he had belonged to the Count. Now 8 people remained. Adelaide set aside the pantry list and looked at what the house possessed rather than what the planned meal lacked. There were potatoes, onions, and broth. The vegetable pie would not feed everyone as a main dish, but it could be cut into small, warm pieces beside the soup. The stale bread was unsuitable for the table in its present state, yet it remained sound. The apples were soft. 1 egg rested in the wire basket. The milk was limited, but hot water was not. "We shall make the soup first," Adelaide said. Nell moved the largest pot onto the range. Mrs. Webb added the peeled potatoes, while Adelaide sliced the onions more thinly than usual, so they would soften quickly. The remaining broth went in, followed by water from the kettle and a spoonful of dripping that had been kept beneath a saucer. The pot no longer contained the chicken broth planned for supper. It became something else: potato, onion, warmth, and enough substance to prepare 8 people for what followed. Adelaide cut the vegetable pie into squares. They were not equal. The larger pieces would go to Miss Cole and Mrs. Webb, who had traveled through the snow. The children would receive smaller pieces with more potato. Mrs. Vale's portion came from the softer center. No one objected to the difference, because no one was being overlooked. The winter pudding required more thought. Adelaide placed all the stale bread upon the work table. It appeared insufficient while arranged as slices, but when Nell cut it into pieces and filled the wide mixing bowl, its quantity looked less discouraging. Lucy brought the apples from the cellar. There were 5, 2 wrinkled, 1 bruised, and 2 too small to have been chosen for any respectable dish. She sat beside the lamp and peeled them, removing only what could not be used. Mrs. Vale took the currant jar upon her lap and separated the fruit from the few dry stems that remained. Her fingers moved carefully, dropping each currant into a blue saucer. Elsie and May stood upon opposite sides of the bowl. "May we stir?" Elsie asked. "When the milk has been added," Adelaide said, and one at a time. She nearly assigned a number of strokes, then stopped herself. Mrs. Webb poured the remaining milk into a jug. It reached only halfway to the mark Adelaide would once have required. She added hot water in 2 small measures, stirred, then tasted it from a spoon. "Warm enough," she said. Adelaide poured the liquid over the bread. The upper pieces remained dry, so she added more water. They waited while it soaked. No clock was consulted. When Adelaide pressed the spoon into the center and found no hard pieces, the bread was ready. The grated apples followed. Mrs. Vale's currants went in. The single egg was beaten until it could be carried through the whole mixture rather than remain in one part of it. Adelaide opened the spice drawer. May wrinkled her nose when the nutmeg jar was uncorked. Lucy noticed and smiled without saying anything. Adelaide divided the mixture between 2 basins. Into one she added nutmeg and cinnamon, the other received cinnamon alone. One pudding would be mild enough for May and free of the schoolroom taste Lucy disliked. The second could be warmer and more strongly spiced for those returning from the cold. The children stirred in turn. Elsie moved the spoon with grave concentration. May used both hands and leaned her whole small weight against the thick mixture. When it became too heavy, Nell steadied the bowl. Miss Cole came down, carrying a jar wrapped in tissue paper. A customer had given her damson preserve after a fitting, and she had intended to take it home. "It seems unlikely to reach home tonight," she said. The preserve was dark, sharp, and too little to serve 8 people by itself. Adelaide loosened it with warm water, added a spoonful of sugar, and placed it near the range. It would become sauce. The puddings were covered and lowered into 2 pots. Their basins were different sizes, and one cloth had a blue stripe while the other was plain. Adelaide marked neither. She knew which contained the nutmeg because she had tied its string twice around the rim. While they steamed, everyone carried something to the dining room. Nell brought bowls. Lucy collected spoons that did not match. Mrs. Webb moved 2 chairs from the parlor. Miss Cole placed the water jug where the children could not overturn it. Mrs. Vale folded napkins, giving the one with the smallest tear to herself. Adelaide replaced it with an undamaged one without comment. Outside, snow continued against the windows, softening Mill Lane until the village seemed to end at the garden wall. Inside, wet gloves dried along the mantel and the soup sent steam into the room. The 8 chairs did not fit evenly around the table. 2 stood near the corners. May's required a folded cushion. Nell sat beside Mrs. Webb rather than at the end. Adelaide's chair was nearest the kitchen door, but this time a filled bowl waited before it. They ate while the soup was hot. The pie pieces were small, but no one treated them as inadequate. Elsie dipped hers into the broth. Miss Cole gave May the crisp edge from her portion. Mrs. Vale finished the soft center placed upon her plate. The puddings were ready as the bowls were cleared. One emerged paler and slightly flatter. The other had risen against its cloth and carried a shallow fold across the top. Adelaide cut both at the table. She gave May the mild centre, Mrs. Vale a portion with more apple, Lucy a slice without nutmeg and generous sauce, and the two women who had crossed the snow, the warmer pudding. Nell received her plate before taking anyone else's away. Adelaide served herself. After 8 portions had been placed, enough remained for one more. She covered it with the clean white cloth and set it on the sideboard. The damson sauce was thin and stained the pudding purple where it touched. May declared this an improvement. Elsie asked whether paper flowers could be made to resemble violets, and Miss Cole promised to show her in the morning. Mrs. Vale told Mrs. Webb that the church organ had improved, though not sufficiently. Lucy laughed before she finished drinking her water. The talk moved without order. No one waited for Adelaide to guide it. She ate the pudding while it was warm and listened to the small sounds of spoons, chair legs, and the fire settling behind the grate. Nothing upon the table matched her first plan for the evening. Everything upon it was enough. Later, the children were taken upstairs. Miss Cole retrieved paper and wire from her hat box for the promised flowers. Mrs. Webb helped Nell soak the pudding cloths. Mrs. Vale remained near the fire until the room warmed enough for her to leave it. Adelaide returned to the kitchen when the others had gone. The brown book lay where she had opened it. She dried her hands, dipped Judith's pen into the ink, and found a narrow space beneath the note about snow. She wrote slowly, conscious that another hand might one day examine the words without knowing her name. When snow closes the road, count the chairs before the spoons. She waited for the ink to settle. Then, below it, she added one final sentence. The measure is the table. Adelaide left the book open beneath the lamp. Outside, the snow continued falling. Inside, one portion waited under its cloth, and 8 chairs remained drawn close around the table. By morning, the portion beneath the cloth had been eaten. May found it before breakfast and divided it with Elsie. Adelaide discovered the empty plate beside the bread knife and washed it without asking questions. The snow remained for 3 days. Then the gutters began a steady silver tapping. The road reappeared in muddy strips. Elsie and May returned to their parents. Miss Cole's coach continued towards Cirencester, and Mrs. Webb went home carrying dry stockings and half a loaf. Mallow House became quiet again, but it did not become quite the house it had been before the storm. Lucy's supper was kept beside the range when the school detained her. Mrs. Vale received the tender part of a pie without explaining her teeth. Nell sat at the kitchen table and ate before the washing up began. Adelaide sat too. At first, she sometimes forgot. She would fill 3 bowls, place them upon the table, and turn towards the stove before noticing the empty space where her own ought to be. Then she would return for a 4th bowl. The correction was small enough that no one remarked upon it, yet each time it seemed to alter the whole arrangement. She did not cease to measure things. The accounts were balanced every Saturday. The coal was checked before the scuttle grew light. Linen shelves were labelled, and the oldest preserves stood nearest the hand. Adelaide still preferred a straight row of spoons, but the numbers no longer told her everything before she had looked. When she planned a meal, she considered first who would eat it. When she laid the table, she counted the people who might arrive, as well as those already in the room. And whenever the winter pudding was made, one portion waited beneath a clean cloth. Sometimes the portion went to Lucy after an evening of marking copybooks. Once it went home with Nell for her brother. Twice no one came, and Adelaide ate it herself by the low kitchen fire. The holly above the mantel dried, curled, and was taken down. The church bells returned to their ordinary Sunday rhythm. Coal lasted longer in the scuttle, and the strip of light beneath the kitchen curtain remained until after tea. Near the church wall, snowdrops pressed through earth softened by the thaw. A blackbird had begun to sing from the bare pear tree, tentatively at first and then each morning. Judith returned on an afternoon when the lane shone with recent rain. Her hands were still stiff, though less swollen than when she had left, and she climbed the front steps carefully, refusing Nell's arm until the final one. She inspected Mallow House without appearing to inspect it, noting the parlor clock and Adelaide's pantry labels before entering the kitchen. The oak table had not been polished smooth. New rings marked the place where hot basins had stood during the snow. A fine cut crossed one corner where Nell had sliced bread without the board. Judith passed her fingertips over it. "The table has been busy," she said. "Yes," Adelaide replied. The brown book lay open near the flower jar. Judith turned several pages. She paused at Adelaide's writing, reading first the line about the chairs and then the sentence beneath it. Adelaide waited for a question. None came. Judith closed the book gently and looked towards the basket on the dresser. "How many apples does tonight's pudding require?" she asked. Adelaide might once have answered by naming ounces. Instead, she looked through the open door towards the dining room. Mrs. Vale had settled beside the fire. Lucy was expected after school. Nell was carrying coal from the yard. Judith had returned. Adelaide herself would sit down with them. "Two should be enough," she said, "but leave the third by the range, in case someone comes late." Judith nodded, as if this were both an answer and nothing more than an answer. They prepared the pudding together. Adelaide grated one apple and chopped the other. Judith judged the milk by the way the bread yielded beneath the spoon. Nell took her place at the table without being directed. When Lucy arrived, a chair and a warm bowl of soup waited. In the days that followed, Judith spoke of the advice she had received in Bath. She was to avoid carrying heavy trays and to climb fewer stairs. She delivered these instructions with the expression of a woman reporting rules intended for someone else. "The house will require another pair of hands," she said one evening. They were in the kitchen, sorting the winter linen for mending. Outside, the wind moved more softly through the hedge than it had a month before. "It already has them," Adelaide said. Judith folded a napkin along its old crease. "If they wish to remain." Adelaide placed a worn sheet in the mending basket. There were still matters to arrange: wages, duties, which room would be hers, and how the stairs might be divided between them. Such questions did not trouble her. They were ordinary questions, capable of being written down and settled. "They do," she said. No announcement was made upstairs. Mrs. Vale merely asked whether this meant Adelaide would continue preparing the softer turnips. Lucy smiled into her teacup. Nell brought another hook for Adelaide's apron and fixed it beside Judith's upon the kitchen door. The change entered the house in these quiet ways. One evening, After the others had gone upstairs, Adelaide remained in the kitchen. The fire had lowered to a red center. Rainwater slipped from the eaves into the soft garden earth, and somewhere beyond the wall, a late cart moved slowly along the open road. She checked the bread for morning and covered the milk. The accounts lay balanced in their drawer. 5 spoons had been returned to their places. The brown book rested open upon the table. Its pages held broad writing, hurried writing, words in fading pencil, Judith's younger hand, and now Adelaide's own. None of the entries stood alone. Each had been left for someone who might need it later. Beside the book waited a small plate covered with a clean cloth. Perhaps Lucy would come down after finishing her school papers. Perhaps Nell would remember it before walking home. Perhaps no one would require it, and Adelaide would sit beneath the lamp and eat it herself. All 3 possibilities had a place. She lowered the damper, as Judith's first note had instructed, and turned the lamp until the flame became small and steady. The kitchen settled around the marked table, the jars, the hanging spoons, and the scent of apple still warm in the room. Nothing more was required of the house that night. The lamp above the table, the final portion beneath the cloth, and room enough for whoever came next. And now, Mallow House has grown quiet once more. The dishes have been washed, the spoons returned to their drawer, and the fire has lowered to a gentle red glow. Beneath the kitchen lamp, the old brown book rests open beside a small plate covered with a clean white cloth. Perhaps someone will need that final portion before morning. Perhaps it will remain exactly where it is. For tonight, there is enough warmth in the range, enough food in the cupboard, and enough room around the table for everyone who may come. You may leave the kitchen to its silence now. Let the lamp grow dim, let the rain soften beyond the windows, and allow every remaining thought to settle gently away. Nothing more is required of you tonight. The house is resting, and you may rest as well.